Welcome back to the channel, guys. Today we're in a super cool car. This is a 2020 Lotus Evora GT and it looks the business. Several years ago I was lucky enough to review a 2011 Lotus Evora S and I really enjoyed that car, but there were a few ergonomics related problems that I had with it. The pedal box was way off to the right and the interior just lacked quality. It didn't feel anywhere near as refined and well built as a contemporary Porsche. And I believe this 2020 Evora GT might just be the culmination of everything that Lotus has developed on the car to date. Now the letters GT might make you think that this is going to be a softly sprung, comfort-oriented, grand touring car. I mean, after all, that's what GT stands for. But when you really look at the finer details, this car feels every bit as motorsport as something like a Porsche Cayman GT4. So we have the same Toyota 2GR 3.5 liter V6 paired with a supercharger. In this application, it's making 416 horsepower and 317 foot-pounds of torque. It's the same motor that's been powering every pedestrian Toyota and Lexus product essentially since the mid-2000s, but Lotus has really found a way to wake this engine up, make it produce well over 400 horsepower, and give it an incredible sound. You do get quite a bit of supercharger whine, but that's part of the experience with this car. It'll rev out to 7 happily all day long. Now, let's stop for a moment just to take a look at the interior of this Evora GT, and I have to say, Lotus has made some pretty good improvements. There's Alcantara everywhere, very nice stitching. Everything is soft touch now. Even though the wheel has a very thin rim, it feels good in the hand because of the texture of that leather. My only complaint with the interior, I would say, is this aftermarket Alpine head unit looks a little bit tacked on because, I mean, it is. These seats, they're not bucket seats, and yet they don't feel too far off in terms of support. They're definitely designed for a narrower frame like my own, so I actually happen to fit very well in this cabin. Rear seats, well, let's just say that I would not make my worst enemy sit back there, because that is not a seat designed for humans with legs. One of the coolest things here is if you look in the mirror, very poor limited visibility out the back, but the cool part is you can actually see the butterfly valve for the throttle every time you touch that throttle pedal. Let's throw the car into sport mode, turn on the sport exhaust. Lots of mid-range torque from the supercharged V6. Now, what I'm not used to in this car is a throttle response. The supercharger, unfortunately, does dull that initial, when you first go to blip the engine for a downshift, just doesn't want to respond. Now, once you're up in the rev range, it feels like a naturally aspirated motor. But see, I just can't get that heel toe right. I either undershoot or overshoot that blip. It's funny, I've been seeing a lot of Toyotas on the road while driving this car, and every time I'm thinking, is the engine in this the same engine that's in that? More often than not, the answer is probably yes. V6 Camrys, Lexus RXs, they all pretty much have the Toyota 2GR V6. Tons and tons of steering feel from this hydraulic rack. This is on par with the best of Porsche's hydraulic steering, right around the same time that the Evora first came out. Wow, a rev limiter kicked in before 7,000, it seemed like. That was a little odd. Very sharp front end. That's mid-engine balance for you right there. Tons of feedback in the steering, but I just can't get that rev match right. Very unfortunate. Maybe, you know, if you live with a car longer, you get used to that throttle response, but I cannot get it right for the life of me right now. This shifter, surprisingly good for a Lotus. I think this is one of the areas where they've made massive improvements over the years. I've often been very critical of Lotus shifters, but this one's pretty good. That Toyota V6 sounds so good in this car. It has a really nice aggressive growl to it, and with the sports exhaust off like we have now, you get a good amount of induction note but very limited exhaust note, which is great if you're just trying to stay a little low-key. This car is anything but low-key. The way it looks, how low and wide it sits. Braking, amazing. As good as Porsche GT braking. Almost, I would say. The initial bite of that pedal isn't quite as sharp, but really easy to modulate. I believe these brakes are from AP Racing, so that is no surprise there, why they feel so good. Now, I think my favorite part of this car, though, is actually not the engine or the brakes or the steering, but the suspension. It just gives me so much control in the corners. It feels like it's tuned for track use. It has a very high quality damper. Plenty of compliance over bumps here. Overall, just the ride quality and the level of noise inside the cabin, pretty low in this car. When you're just putting around at low RPM, it's actually a very refined driving experience. Steering's light, easy to use. Seating position is spot on. I would say at least as comfortable as a Porsche 981 Cayman GT4. Compared to the GT4 though, what this lacks is that razor sharp throttle response. It's got the steering feel, it's got the braking feel, it's got the overall grip and the balance through corners. But that engine, even though it makes lots of torque and it has a solid top end to go with it, the response just isn't quite there. It makes rev matching a real challenge in this thing. I can't believe I'm saying this, but I almost wish Lotus offered this manual transmission with an auto rev match feature. Now that aside, I really do believe the Evora GT is right up there with the Cayman GT4, at least a 981, for overall performance and that fun to drive factor. At the same time, this car is such a looker from the outside. It's so much more aggressive and just visually stimulating. The GT4 just looks like any other Cayman that's been lowered a bit, given bigger wheels and a wing and a splitter. It really doesn't have a huge visual impact, but this car just screams exotic. And as far as British cars go, I'm very, very impressed with the build quality of the interior. Everything feels solidly built. Now, considering this is an old chassis that Lotus has improved many times, I'm so curious now what the new Emira will feel like. Not only how it will feel to drive, but how the build quality and the interior design will stack up against the competition. I think over the years, Porsche has sort of just taken off into another echelon of interior design and build quality that even this Evora can't quite match. But I think the Emira, since it is a brand new platform, is very promising indeed. But until then, this is probably the best Lotus I've ever driven as an all-encompassing sports car that can be driven on the street. The Elise, I think, is certainly still more raw and perhaps a little bit more fun to drive. But for me, I'd rather have a car that can do it all, and this Evora GT fits that GT moniker just right. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.